The conversations surrounding the Ohio State Buckeyes and Ryan Day really fascinate me because I feel like there is so much lost perspective, both amongst Ohio State fans, college football fans, analysts. I even think that the lost perspective has seeped into the coaching staff, at least in the past, has seeped into the coaching staff and into Ryan Day's head, that it's just crazy. It's like cabin pressure surrounding the topic of Ohio State has been completely lost. No more oxygen. The plane has already crashed. Every time I hear an article or listen to an article or see a headline about Ohio State football, part of me kind of just whimpers and just expects the worst. You have ESPN ranking Day as the 10th best head coach in the country, and many people saying they're not high on him. I know some Michigan fans, even a friend of mine who views him as John Cooper 2.0, and Ohio State fans who view him that way. There are also some few remaining Ohio State fans who, while they're frustrated with his past failures against Michigan, finally think that this team is going to break through because they used their NIL resources and they returned a lot of starters and they're just going to blow through everyone. Again, I think perspective on this team has been totally lost. So what I want to do in today's video is I want to set some perspective, mainly on the football team, the 2024 team, but also I want to set the perspective a little bit on the Ohio State football program. And in regards to the team, I'll talk about Oregon, Penn State, and Michigan as well, because along with Ohio State, these are the four teams that are probably going to win the conference. And there is a strong chance that all four of these teams, or at least three out of the four, definitely two out of the four, make the college football playoff, the expanded 12-team playoff. And the fact that all of these teams, these four, were ranked in the top 10 of every power rankings index last season. They were in the top 10 as well for most of the season, whether it was the college football playoff rankings or the AP or coaches poll. They looked like a part of the 10 best teams in the country. And I'd argue Michigan, Ohio State, and Oregon some weeks looked straight up like the top three in the country. Is awesome. I'm glad that the Big Ten has multiple teams that I think can be strong contenders, not just for beating strong out-of-conference teams, not just for winning the conference and making Big Ten football exciting, but also contending for the national championship. I think it's a mistake to only believe that Oregon and Ohio State can contend for it all in the Big Ten, though by the odds market and by what I'll discuss in this video, it's reasonable to assume that those two have the best odds to win the national championship. But before we dive into the team specifically, I want to talk about Ohio State football as a program. This program has only had 5 losing seasons. 5 since the end of World War II. That means over the past 79 years, I'm going to round it to 80, the past 80 seasons, 1945 to 2024, going to round it to 80. 1 out of every 16 seasons is below 500. The last season that was below 500 was in 2011. I'm a pretty young guy for being a college football analyst and having a college football channel that is as successful as this one, and I have all of you guys who are watching to thank for that, not myself. But I'm a pretty young guy. And in 2011, I was 9 years old. I mean, that's how long ago Ohio State's last losing season was. They went 6-7 under Luke Fickell, the interim head coach, who's now at Wisconsin, much more successful, definitely repaired his image after that 2011 disaster. And they also went 3-5 in the Big Ten. Lost to some pretty bad teams, including the fact they lost to a Brady Hoke Michigan team, though they nearly beat them. But that's beside the point. I don't want to get off topic. The point I'm making is Ohio State is an extremely successful program. They are a blue blood. In fact, I think they probably have the best winning percentage, perhaps by a mile, since the end of World War II. I don't know that for a fact. I know for a fact they've only had 5 losing seasons since the end of World War II. But it's making an educated guess based off of what I've heard and the fact that Ohio State really kicked off having their success, of course, under Woody Hayes, and then from there, the snowball has rolled. I've defended Day multiple times on this channel. Multiple times. And the pressure that he's facing entering this season is asinine. It's ridiculous. He's 39-3 in Big Ten Conference play. He's 56-8 overall. And people are talking about him as if they would want to see him walk out, and make sure the door hits him on the behind, or they kick him out with a steel-toe boot. That is like a child wanting a successful dad who is a millionaire, heck, maybe even a billionaire. Not perfect. No head coach is perfect. But overall, he is loving, caring, intelligent, wise. He's everything that you could want in a dad. And Ryan Day, I think, while I wouldn't say he's everything you want in a head coach, he's pretty close. He's an elite head coach, at worst, a near elite head coach. And every coach, even Nick Saban, even Bear Bryant, even Woody Hayes, even Bo Schembechler, any head coach you know, whether as a human or on the field, has had their faults, has had their losses. But because your father has missed a few of your birthday parties, which is a big deal, but ultimately, in my opinion, not a deal breaker, especially when he's being hunted down in 22 and 23, because Ryan Day lost to Michigan, 21, maybe it was a fluke, but in 22 and 23, Michigan was trying to assassinate Ohio State, and they were successful. And in 22, they absolutely embarrassed the Buckeyes. Because of that, the child wants the dad out the door. And a lot of Ohio State fans want Ryan Day of Columbus. And while it's understandable, you have to put things in context. The only reason why dad didn't attend some of your birthday parties is because there was a highly trained and highly paid government assassin trying to kill him. And he got badly bruised. The only reason Ryan Day hasn't beaten Michigan in 3 seasons is because he has faced Michigan's best team in school history, in modern history, the 2023 Michigan Wolverines, Michigan's best team as it specifically relates to regular season dominance, the 2022 Michigan Wolverines, and a Michigan team that was tough enough to overcome nearly a 2-decade drought in winning the Big Ten, winning several close games, and beating a rival that honestly had gotten in their head and beaten them the past decade in the Ohio State Buckeyes. That was the 2021 Michigan Wolverines. And as I've said in other videos, to other friends, in comment sections, Urban Meyer, his best Ohio State team, the 2014 team, in the regular season, they would get beaten by the 2023 and 2022 Wolverines. Now, if you want to debate with me that in the postseason, that they could overthrow those teams, I will have that debate with you, because Cardale Jones, Ezekiel Elliott, Michael Thomas, there are other names I'm forgetting, but that team was loaded, and in the postseason, they were wicked. Also, Urban Meyer is a college football legend and genius, so there's that. That's the only team. Every other team falls to 2023 and 2022 Michigan, and Jim Harbaugh gets to have his cringe smile with the headset down as all those Urban Meyer teams lose to those two, perhaps by double digits. And half of Urban Meyer's teams lose to the 2021 squad. Michigan has awoken from its slumber, playing like a blue blood, developing like a blue blood, developing coaches, staffers like a blue blood as well, not just players. And look, I don't know what else you want me to tell you. Maybe you didn't even want to hear that, but I think that's the reality, is that Ryan Day is facing a tougher opponent in the regular season, a tougher program, a taller task than whatever Urban Meyer had to face at Ohio State. What, you're going to tell me that Mark D'Antonio in that same time frame was able to build the same caliber of teams that these past 3 Michigan teams were? Baloney. Absolutely not. You're going to tell me that James Franklin in 2016 and 17 was the same challenge? You're going to tell me that Jim Harbaugh in 16 and 18, in 17 with Tim Drevno as OC was the same challenge? Of course you're not going to, because that's being intellectually dishonest. Ryan Day does have a Michigan problem, and he needs to figure it out sooner rather than later. And it's understandable why the frustration is there, because Ohio State has missed out on 2 undefeated regular seasons in a row. They've missed out on what I think would have been a 15-0 season last year if they beat Michigan. And in 2022, despite losing to Michigan, they nearly won it all. But that Georgia loss changed things, I'd say as much as the Michigan losses did. If Ryan Day beat Georgia and then beat TCU, his 1-3 record against Michigan wouldn't matter so much, because he has a national championship and because he beat an elite team, another elite team in Georgia, and it would have been one of his few wins against elite teams. The only other one I can conjure up would be 2020 Clemson, and I don't even know if they were an elite team that season. But I think it's so needed to set perspective on this program and where it's at. It's not as tough as Urban Meyer's program. That's a fact. The injuries piling up, this team not having the it factor against elite teams like Urban Meyer showcased against Alabama and Oregon in 2014, like he showcased against Michigan in 2016. That was a near elite to elite Michigan team, especially in terms of raw talent. And Ohio State crawled back after being down by 10 points in Columbus, and they won that game and clinched a spot in the college football playoff. They beat Penn State in 2017 despite being down by nearly 3 scores, or I think maybe even 3 scores. The Urban teams had the it factor. They had the toughness, and Day needs to find that. And I think what he needs to do, what he needed to do is gut the strength and conditioning staff. Needed an upgrade there. Everywhere else, though, except for maybe the safeties coach spot, he's made upgrades. This team is faster, they are more athletic, they are more talented, and I think they're more adaptive. I think as a program, Ohio State right now is more adaptive than it was under Urban Meyer. You know, Urban Meyer was sort of teetering on the verge of not imploding, that's a lie, but of declining toward the end of his tenure. The 18 and 17 teams being closer to a waste of talent than his first few teams, which were very impressive. Going 12-0 in 2012 was incredible with Tressel's players, and also with the prior season being a 6-7 team. Ryan Day right now, I don't think that's happening, because the 2023 and 2022 teams were certainly better than the 2021 team. Maybe at times better than the 2020 team, which played in a very weak Big Ten, and we didn't know who Ohio State was really until the college football playoff. It was mostly speculation for a lot of that year, but as was much of COVID. I think I've talked enough on this, so we're going to move on, but I just wanted to set some perspective, in my opinion. Because whether it's Michigan or Ohio State fans saying Ryan Day's the next John Cooper, and that's not correct. John Cooper had a sub-500 season, several seasons with more than 2 losses, and like Urban Meyer, he choked against small programs. Day has only lost to the big guns. He has beaten every team he should beat. In terms of beating all the unranked teams, the only team he's lost to that wasn't ranked in the top 10, I think, was Oregon in 2021. And there are some games he's lost where he's the favorite, but overall, he beats the teams that he should beat, and that includes the ranked teams, and that's very, very hard to do. It is. He has not lost to an unranked opponent yet at Ohio State. And that's impressive. And he also has a winning record against top 10 teams and a winning record against top 25 teams. So I just wanted to set some perspective there. He's not John Cooper 2.0. I don't think he's the same coach that Urban Meyer was yet. He could develop into that. We'll just have to wait and see. Before we move on to talk about Ohio State, Oregon, Michigan, and Penn State, And who out of the bunch is the best team in the Big Ten entering this season? I want to give a shout out to my Patreons, pardon me, for sponsoring this video and channel. This is also a neat place to remind you all to like this video, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, and comment your thoughts on this video down below. Tell me if you agree with what I just said in the previous, I'd say, 13, 14 minutes that I spent talking and somewhat ranting, because I didn't intend it to be more than really 10 minutes ranting about Ohio State and the perspective surrounding their program. Because I do think it is very off. Again, the pressure is understandable, and I'm going to talk more about that when I deep dive into this year's team specifically. But didn't Ohio State have this same game-breaking pressure entering last season? Because it kind of felt like it. Not quite the same on the national stage in particular, but it felt that way in last preseason, especially in the week leading up to the game with the whole sign-stealing stuff in the background. It really felt like Ohio State needed that win last year in the same way that people are saying they need the win over Michigan, the win in Indy this season. It feels very similar to last season. And maybe I'm incorrect on that, but it feels like a slightly heightened version of last year's pressure on Ohio State. But let's talk about Ohio State entering 2024, shall we? And then we'll talk about the other three teams as they relate to Ohio State, because this is an Ohio State video, but I want to ask a question, and some of it might be rhetorical, but who's the best team in the Big Ten right now? Not who's the best program, because you could measure that in more ways than who's the best team. Well, best program by recent success, by future projections. Asking who's the best team just means who's the best this year. It's a simpler question. Who's the best team in 2024 in the Big Ten? Is it Michigan? Is it Penn State? Is it Oregon? Is it Ohio State? Tell me down below. If you say any other team than those, you're either a genius who can see the future, or I don't know what you're smoking and I don't want to even sniff it. I don't. It's probably one of those four teams. Maybe USC. You may not be high and pick USC, but I would still call you crazy. Let's talk about Ohio State, though. Ohio State entering this season, they return 65% of their production from last year. That puts them at 56th in the country. You know what their returning production was entering last season? It was 48th. They returned 67% of their production from the 2022 season into the 2023 season. Ohio State, similarly to last year in the preseason, I think is going to make strides defensively. One of my accurate predictions entering 2023 was that Ohio State would have an elite defense, that their secondary would be one of the best in the country. That turned out to be true. Now, I'm not saying I'm perfect. I've made multiple mistakes in my predictions, but predicting Michigan and Ohio State was something I got spot on last year, outside of the fact that I believed Ohio State would have an elite offense and that Michigan would light up the board with their offense and ground game. But in an overall sense, especially with wins and losses, I was pretty close. In fact, in the regular season, spot on. Ohio State is one of the deepest and most talented rosters in college football, and their raw talent in terms of recruiting is unmatched in the Big Ten Conference. Raw talent is the talent you have before you apply development. It truly is unmatched. But this has been Ohio State basically every single season. Basically every single season, at least in the past decade. And if not for most years in the 21st century, if not all of them. This is nothing new. It's an advantage of theirs, but they have to correctly apply it. Again, want to circle back to last season. There are similarities between this team and last year's team. You have controversy at quarterback, but you have some depth there, at least the speculation of depth at the quarterback position. Wide receiver is an area of difference. There's a lot of new territory this year at wide receiver. Last year, a lot of familiarity. The offensive line is an area with questions, much like last year. The defense, while things look bright on the returning production end, and there's optimism, there are still some things to improve on, though that's just a small similarity, as Ohio State's defense in 2022 finished off with a disappointment. The 2023 defense was far from the most disappointing side of the ball. It was very impressive, solidifying my opinion that Jim Knowles is an elite defensive coordinator. He just needed time, like everyone does, to institute their system into a program, a school that had a totally different operating system beforehand. The computer needed to reboot, and once Jim Knowles rebooted that computer, that Ohio State defense, it was humming, and it will hum this season. But there are similarities between this year's team and last year's team in regards to numbers. The biggest difference is Michigan last year returned 81% of their production, 5th in the nation, 4th on offense, 16th on defense. This season, they only returned 36% of their production. The highest team in the Big Ten doesn't even match Michigan's returning production number. Iowa is first in the Big Ten right now in updated returning production at 79%. Oregon, the highest of the top 4 teams, is only at 69%. So Ohio State is not going to face any team in the Big Ten that will have the same combination of veterancy, talent, and development as Michigan, as last year's Michigan. They will not face that type of team this year by preseason numbers. That alone, despite arguably a harder strength of schedule, is an advantage. They're not going to be facing the same again, team that is senior laden, that is big, that's physical, that has that athleticism, the potential for an elite passing game, an elite ground game, an elite run defense, pass defense, and great special teams. Michigan was not all of those things all the time last year, but at times last year, they were all those things, if that made sense. So Ohio State does have some advantages entering the season, some that are new, some that are more so the same. They're strong at quarterback, running back, wide receiver, defensive tackle, linebacker, and especially safety and corner. This team is loaded, but again, that's nothing new, and Ohio State fans will tell you that all day long. I think this team is up there with Georgia and Oregon in terms of potential. Now, potential is something that I tend to measure on its own terms. A team like USC is a strong example. USC might have top 10 potential, in my opinion. And by top 10 potential, I don't mean the potential to be ranked in the top 10. I mean if you ranked every team's ceiling, they might be top 10 if you're only to look at a team's ceiling. But I don't like USC's consistency. I don't think they'll be very consistent. So that's why I have them beating LSU. At least I had them beating LSU. I'm updating my record predictions in the Big Ten and for college football right now. That's why I had them beating LSU but losing to Minnesota on the road, because I don't think their consistency will be great. They will fluctuate from being incredibly frustrating to watch to looking like a team where if they replicated their ceiling, they could win the national championship. Ohio State has the type of ceiling that's the highest in the country, with also a very high floor. There were people trying to convince me that Ohio State would lose 3 games last year. And although they played Penn State and Wisconsin tight, and in another reality they lose those games, and even though they had to have a final drive to beat Notre Dame, they game-controlled Penn State to death. They game-controlled Wisconsin to death. And on a different day, they probably game-control Notre Dame to death. I mean, that defense, again, was elite. Best pass defense, statistically, in the country. Now, Iowa or Michigan secondary healthy might have been better, and I'd say probably would have had a higher ceiling. But in terms of statistics, which is the best case for evidence that we have on hand, they were the best pass defense in the country last season. Kyle McCord, good, great quarterback, an elite receiver room when healthy, an underrated tight end, Cade Stover. They were not losing 3 games last year. At most, they were losing 1, because their one loss in the regular season that came to Michigan was only by 6 points. And they were in the same situation they were in that Notre Dame game, except both sides in Michigan and Ohio State in that game were better offensively than Ohio State and Notre Dame were. The Buckeyes have what it takes to win it all. The question is, will they? They can win the Big Ten by overwhelming teams with their offense and bullying them with their NFL defense. With Quinshon, Judkins and TreVeyon Henderson, an offensive line that returns NFL-level guard Donovan Jackson. Seth McLaughlin has questions at center, especially at snapping the ball, but outside of that, he's at least decent. Should be an improvement over Carson Hinsman by what it sounds like. And at wide receiver, Carnell Tate, Brandon Innes, Jeremiah Smith, Emeka Egbuka, that receiver room is going to be loaded. There won't be the same Marvin Harrison Jr. type player, but in terms of passing the ball around, in terms of actually spreading out defenses and being threatening, this receiver core might be better and probably will be better in terms of balance. The defense returns everyone who matters except for Steel Chambers, Tommy Eichenberg, and Josh Proctor. They return 8 starters from last season and add Caleb Downs, and they're moving Sonny Styles to linebacker. So I look at Ohio State, and the question is, will they win the Big Ten? Will they win it all? They have the second best odds to win the Big Ten, or to win it all. The best odds to win the Big Ten, pardon me. And Caleb Downs, Denzel Burke, Jordan Hancock, Lathan Ransom. That secondary is so deep that I can't describe enough the fact that they are in their own tier. The Silver Bullets secondary is. It is a loaded unit. Future first rounder in Caleb Downs. Denzel Burke will be a first rounder in the 2025 NFL draft. And at defensive tackle, Ty Hamilton, Tyleik Williams. Defensive end, Jack Sawyer had a breakout year last year. And JT Tuimoloau is great. So this team, it's understandable why they're preseason number 1 almost unanimously outside of maybe Oregon in the Big Ten. And they're up there with Georgia in terms of national championship odds. They have the reputation at staff, head coach, and roster. They return a lot of their production. But it is intriguing to point out that they have some similarities with last year's team. They do, in terms of they return the same amount of production. And that's even adjusted for Ohio State's incoming transfers this season. And also the transfers that they lost. It's adjusting for all those things. Bill Connolly is a genius. And looking at the roster build, the offensive line still has questions. Quarterback, questions. The defense should, again, progress. This should be Jim Knowles' best defense ever at Ohio State, potentially in his history as a head coach. Last year's probably was, but he can up that feat even more. And wide receivers once again loaded. So it's kind of cool, and also might even strike fear into the fact that this year's team is similar to last year's team. Can they get it done? Can that be the difference? Is not necessarily the build of the team, but can Ohio State just push forward and get the necessary wins that last year's team really failed to do in one game against Michigan? The 12-team playoff being implemented last season would have been awesome. And Oregon, along with Ohio State last year, would have been one of those not automatically qualifying bids, but they would have been one of the at-large selections, because Oregon sitting at 11-2, entering the final college football playoff rankings, that was the best 2-loss team in the country, easily. Oregon was, I would say, the second most dominant team in terms of the eye test. They were the second most dominant team behind Michigan. And Ohio State and Georgia were pretty close, but Georgia at times throughout the season looked kind of iffy. Oregon only looked iffy in their 2 losses. And Georgia and Ohio State looked iffy in their losses and also in some of their wins as well. But again, that's why I said eye test, not evidence-based. Oregon's advantage is similar to Ohio State's, in my mind. They have the raw talent. They have the explosiveness. But something they have that I don't think Ohio State has is they're one of college football's most physical and tough teams. And they pair that with an explosiveness on offense that every Ryan Day team except last year's had. And while Chip Kelly should be an upgrade, and I think he is, Chip Kelly's offense wasn't all that great last year either. So I would say Oregon is and deserves to be viewed as a more secure team on the offensive side of the ball than Ohio State. They are strong at quarterback, running back, wide receiver, the offensive line, whether that's tackle, guard, center, and I think even defensive tackle and defensive end. Oregon is strong as well. They are in the same category as Ohio State and Georgia in terms of potential. It's those three teams. Maybe you could say Alabama. They've made some very nice moves in the portal, and they have more talent than Oregon and Ohio State do. Georgia may have passed them in the team talent composite, but we won't know 24/7 Sports team talent composite until the end of August. Also, a little bit of a side note, ESPN's FPI hasn't released yet, which is odd because it's typically released in April, but I think that's because the spring portal window, so I wonder when the 2024 FPI will be released, and I'll definitely have a reaction video for that. But getting back to Oregon, and speaking of which, they were top 5 in FPI to end the season, and they lead these 4 teams in terms of returning production. Penn State did in the first iteration of returning production, but they lost some players in the spring portal window. They didn't gain any. Oregon picked up players, specifically Derek Harmon, in the spring portal window. I really like Oregon. I watched their spring game, and they moved up from 3 to 2 in my power rankings instantly. I could no longer justify having Michigan ahead of them. I couldn't. So they moved from 3 below Michigan and Ohio State to 2. They combine, in my opinion, the best of Michigan and Ohio State, the physicality, the grit, and the trench play of Michigan, though I don't think quite to the same level, but very close. And while they don't have the same depth at secondary or at receiver, at the perimeter positions, even at running back, I would say even at quarterback, as Ohio State, they're pretty close there as well. They combine the next to best addition of both of the big two, which begs the question of, is a more balanced version of Michigan and Ohio State that doesn't quite have the same ceiling in the categories in which the Buckeyes and Wolverines are elite at, does that team beat Michigan or beat Ohio State straight up? Or do you have to have the number one place in physicality and or perimeter and skill position play to win in a conference this deep, or to win the national championship and beat Georgia? Is it better to be well-rounded and balanced, or to be hyper-focused, very pinpointed? Because Ohio State over the past few seasons on average has been almost more so pinpointed at times. Last year it was pinpointed on defense. The prior 2 seasons it was the passing offense. Michigan was well-rounded last year, but they were still pinpointed in their trench play. They were just so good at every other position that they could still, pound the rock, try and run the ball even when it didn't work, and you had J.J. McCarthy and Colston Loveland, Roman Wilson, Cornelius Johnson, you could convert on 3rd and long. I mean, that's how good that Michigan team was. The only other Ohio State team under Day that I can really compare to last year's Michigan team was the 2019 team. Oregon last year was very dominant. I think they were a lot like 2022 Ohio State. They just didn't have the same strength of schedule, so their defense never got exposed unless they faced Washington. And Washington didn't have the depth on offense that Ohio State did to score 40 or 50 points on that Oregon defense. They can only score in the 30s. And they won those games because Kalen DeBoer is a tactician, and I think the second best head coach in the country behind Kirby Smart. He could be the best coach in the country. I mean, he's had success with talentless rosters compared to the one that he's had at Alabama. Heck, he reached the national championship game and competed in it last season for 2 to 3 quarters with a roster that was similar to Wisconsin's or Nebraska's in terms of recruiting prowess. Dan Lanning has faced some criticism, much like Ryan Day has, in terms of winning big games, But like Day, I'm high on Lanning, and I'm high on Oregon's staff. And with Dylan Gabriel at quarterback, Jordan James and Noah Whittington at running back, with Josh Connerly Jr. and Johnny Cornelius at offensive tackle, with Tez Johnson and Evan Stewart at wide receiver, Gary Bryant Jr. as well, Terrence Ferguson at tight end, Jamari Caldwell and Derek Harmon at defensive tackle, Jeffrey Bassa at linebacker, with Mateo Uyunglele and Jordan Birch at defensive end. I wouldn't have known Oregon's roster this well a few months ago. But here I am. They're in the Big Ten, so now it's my responsibility to know this roster pretty well. Oh, also don't forget Jabbar Muhammad at corner. They're probably strong at corner too. I just don't think they have the same depth there as the other positions I listed. But this roster's deep. They have a high ceiling. I love the physicality. The only question in relationship to are they the best team in the Big Ten is Lanning's game management in the defense. Because even though I think Oregon has a more physical identity, they definitely have a better offensive line, and I think consequentially better offense than Ohio State. Do they have that same security and depth and even the same type of coaching staff on defense? Because I can tell you for a fact, Tosh Lupoy is not as good of a defensive coordinator or defensive mind as Jim Knowles is. But Oregon has a plethora of advantages. You know what another team who has a plethora of advantages does? And a team who's utilized many of these same advantages to just beat Ohio State over their head for the previous 3 seasons? What Michigan has essentially done to Ohio State, especially in 21 and 22. Last year was more of a fair fight. Ohio State did a pretty good job in stopping Michigan's ground attack and making them just take small portions, small bites in the passing game. It was really, really what it was. And apologies for the pause, but I think it's important. Really, what Ohio State's lost to Michigan last year was a snowball effect of the previous 2 seasons, and a snowball effect of what things that Michigan was doing correctly and Ohio State constantly pivoting in their identity so that when the time to strike came, they were ready and they had built themselves into a juggernaut in all facets, and they just didn't. But I'll get into that more in a few seconds. Michigan in 21 and 22 basically put bowling balls in a sock and just beat Ohio State to death in a very, physical and unfair fight. And unfair, I'm not just using that to reference to Connor Stallions and the sign stealing stuff, but even factoring that out, because you can factor that out. Even factoring that out, the trench play, the physical advantage, the strength advantage that Michigan had over Ohio State was unfair those 2 seasons. They were not the same teams in terms of strength, in terms of toughness. They weren't. And the game in 21 and 22 is an example of that. Look, Michigan cheated. I'm a Michigan fan. I've admitted to that. Michigan fans who pretend that Michigan didn't cheated are idiots. And I'm confident in saying that. But I'm also confident in saying that you take Connor Stallions and the sign stealing out of everything, Michigan probably doesn't lose an additional game, or if they do, it's maybe 1, maybe 2. And Michigan losing a regular season game in 22, if it's not to Ohio State, or even if it is to Ohio State, but everything else remains constant, they get into the playoff anywhere from a 4 seed to a 2 seed. They still get in the playoff. And in 21, yeah, that changes things quite a bit. So I'll give anyone who says that not cheating would change things credit, because if Michigan loses to Penn State in 21, maybe things are different. But if they still get a win over Ohio State, Harbaugh probably keeps his job. And in 22, they probably still compete for the playoff. I lean more so toward the fact that they get in, because Michigan's physical, because they develop well. And even though because they broke the rules and they should be punished for that, you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. That's ridiculous. That's the same thing in a different light as saying we should kick Ryan Day out of Ohio State, out of Columbus, because he's lost to Michigan 3 times. You have to put things in context. Yeah, losing to Michigan 3 times is bad. Cheating and violating the rules, the integrity of the sport, is even worse. But you have to put both things into context. Because the last thing that Ohio State needs to do is just pretend that Michigan didn't beat them for the previous 3 seasons, because that will prevent them from beating Michigan this year. Michigan is still one of the most physical and tough teams in the country, and returning Mason Graham, Kenneth Grant, Derek Moore, and Josiah Stewart on the defensive line, and the way that this offensive line with starting center Greg Crippen, incoming transfer Josh Preby, tackle Miles Hinton returning, and Giovanni El-Hadi, who's had some starts at guard, coming back. The way the trenches looked in the spring game was very impressive. It was very fascinating. I still think that Michigan has some of the best trench play in the country. And I think right now the best trench play in the country. The Wolverines are strong at running back, tight end, the offensive line, the defensive line, and I would say cornerback with Will Johnson, because he's that good of a player, even with questionable depth. The problem that Michigan has is they're practically only trench play. This team reminds me of a better version of the 2021 team, which is awesome and can totally win the Big Ten. In fact, given how the Big Ten operates, maybe they should be the favorite in that regard, but that means they have a very limited ceiling. A team with a very inconsistent passing offense is probably not winning the national championship, especially in a 12-team playoff where you have to play 3 or 4 playoff games and not just 2. So the chance of you going on a fluky run and winning it all are essentially neutered, because the teams with better depth, of which Michigan is not one of those teams this year, those teams are going to float to the top. Even if an unfortunate incident pushes them 6 feet under into the pool, they will have more time to float to the top. They just will. Tackling, consistency, power, running backs, and interior trench play, though, that wins the Big Ten. And after winning a national championship, all Michigan will want to do is win the Big Ten and be the best team in the Big Ten. Does it matter if they have the highest ceiling? Well, certainly if you want to win a national championship, and I think Michigan wants to win one, but do they have that same urgency that Ohio State does to win it all? I think obviously not. And they can still be the best team in the Big Ten. In terms of power rankings, I might put a cap on that. I might say with Ohio State and Oregon, I have a pretty hard time seeing Michigan be the best in terms of power rankings. But in terms of wins, losses, in terms of resume, easily they could be the best team in the Big Ten. You know, you want to know how Michigan can go 12-0 this year? A bunch of one-possession games where they run the ball, they chew clock, and they just bait Ryan Day and Dan Lanning into going for it on 4th down and failing. They bait Dylan. They bait those coaches into putting Dylan Gabriel and Will Howard in 4th down situations, and Michigan's defensive line just 1, 2 sack, maybe a forced fumble, maybe enough pressure for an incomplete pass. Kind of like Alabama's defense flustering Stetson Bennett on 4th and 10 in the 2021 SEC championship game. In a one-possession game. And then maybe beating Northwestern by only 14 points, or struggling against rival Michigan State, but still winning. That's how Michigan can win the Big Ten and potentially compete for it all, is they win in a bunch of close games and they game control opponents to death, even though they don't nearly have the same depth as the previous 2 Michigan teams did. Look for Donovan Edwards at running back, who might be the best running back in the Big Ten, and that's even with Quinshon, Judkins, and TreVeyon Henderson. Even with those 2 phenoms, and with Nicholas Singleton, Katron Allen, with Jordan James, with Kyle Monangai, he can be the best back in the Big Ten. Look at offensive tackle for Miles Hinton, Josh Preby, and Giovanni El-Hadi at guard, Will Johnson at corner, along with probably Jaden McBurrows, Quentin Johnson at safety, Zeke Berry at safety, Jayshon Barham at linebacker, and then Mason Graham, Kenneth Grant at defensive tackle, even Rashawn Berry. Michigan has the best defensive tackle room in the country by a mile, in the same way that Ohio State is the best secondary in the country by a mile. This will be one of college football's most consistent teams. They will have a higher floor than most people expect, but I agree with a lot of people in the fact that Michigan's ceiling is limited this year. I think they can win it all, but more so because I think this year is going to be a down year in college football. If you were to place this Michigan team in last year or 2022's lineup, or especially 2019's, I'd probably say they could, but I'd be stretching it rather than making that argument in good faith. I'd be stretching it there and saying they're good enough to where they may be able to, but it's more hypothetical and just trying to cover up my tracks and make sure I don't miss a dark horse rather than putting serious stock into them competing for one, which I'd more so put serious stock into Michigan competing for it this year because it's a down year. And the same essentially goes for the final team we're going to be talking about today, which is Penn State. Penn State returns the second most production out of these four teams, bringing back 67% of their 2023 production. And I'm going to talk about Penn State differently than these other three because they have about as much to show for their talent and for their success as Oregon. The difference is they don't look nearly as dominant. They don't return as much production. They haven't recruited at the same level. And Dan Lanning is only in year 3 now. Franklin's been at Penn State for 10 years. And the best he has to show is a fluke win over Ohio State in 2016 and a shootout against a Paul Chryst team with a backup quarterback in the 2016 Big Ten championship game. That Penn State run was incredible. I mean, according to power rankings, that Penn State team had no business being in the top 10, but that's because early on in the year they struggled mightily. By the end of the year, they were dominant offensively, and they morphed into the team that could have been in 2017. This Penn State team, if everything goes right, could be Franklin's best. They have questions, yes, at secondary, at quarterback, and many other positions. They have more questions in my mind than any of these other three teams. They have more depth than Michigan by virtue of the fact that they just return more, but that's about it. Michigan is a lot more secure in other areas, and Oregon and Ohio State especially are more secure than Penn State. Penn State's advantage, outside of their veterancy and the fact that they have coaching continuity, is Andy Kotelnicki. Andy Kotelnicki is their secret weapon. He is their nuclear scientist. He is their Oppenheimer to James Franklin's United States government trying to figure out how to capitulate Japan. Or in this weird analogy, for James Franklin trying to figure out how to win the Big Ten, which is incomplete because the United States would have beaten Japan regardless of the atom bomb. James Franklin will probably finish his career winless against Ryan Day, potentially even with Andy Kotelnicki, which is just insane. But please accept the analogy for what it is. Don't make fun of me. The Lions are strong at running back, tight end, defensive tackle. Yes, I know defensive tackle, but they return most of their key contributors. And their defensive tackles, while not as good at stopping the run as many Big Ten defensive tackle units, they function almost as edge rushers in terms of pass rush. I mean, Penn State's defensive tackles are fast, they're nimble, and they're still pretty big. And I think they're still physical. They're just not as physical as other defensive tackle units in the Big Ten. That was one of Manny Diaz's areas that impressed me from 22 to 23, is his defense not only got much better, despite the fact that the secondary got worse, their run defense was legit. Yeah, Michigan ran the ball all over Penn State, but they only scored 24 points, not 41. It was more so Penn State not having an offense and Michigan's awesome defense and the offensive line coming together than it was for Penn State being a paper tiger on run defense and Michigan just kind of flicking them like someone flicking a tick off into the woods. Penn State's defense mightily improved from 22 to 23. Now, it probably will take a step back or at best stay the same as last year, but they'll still have a great defense. They're moving Abdul Carter to defensive end. They have Donnie Dennis Sutton on the other side. They have, I think, Keziah Ezard and Hakeem Beaman coming back on the defensive line, though I don't exactly know Penn State's defensive tackle room. I do know that they return a fair amount, but I just want to make sure that I'm accurate overall. Devon Ellis, Zane Durant, but they do return Ezard and Beaman as well. They're just not projected as starters. And at linebacker, they bring back Kobe King, who will be one of the best linebackers in the Big Ten this year. Dominic DeLuca, Tony Rojas, who played in games as a true freshman last year. Tyler Elsdon, Keon Wiley. They have a deep linebacker room. That's why they were able to move Abdul Carter to defensive end so willingly, is I don't think they're going to take that much of a step back there. And at running back, you got to look out for Nick Singleton, Katron Allen, and Tyler Warren, Andrew Rappelia, and Khalil Dinkins at tight end, a deep tight end room. Drew Aller could be a strength of this team, depending on how he fits in with Kotelnicki's system and how much of a step forward he takes from 22, or from 23 rather, into 24. I don't think he has the same ceiling as, let's say, a J.J. McCarthy, or definitely not the same as a C.J. Stroud for college or the NFL, but McCarthy made a very sizable jump from 22 to 23. Not in terms of passer rating, but in QBR, he made a pretty significant jump. The eye test, the film would tell you he made a significant jump. I think Aller can make a similar jump to where he can become like a top 15, top 20, maybe top 10, though I wouldn't say top 5 quarterback. The Nittany Lions have the running backs, the power, and the pass rush to create havoc in the Big Ten this season, and their schedule's the easiest out of the 4 teams that we talked about today. It's easier than Ohio State's and Michigan's by a mile, and it's easier than Oregon's. And Oregon really has only 2 big games. They only have 2 games where they should be playing a top 10 team. Penn State might only have 1. Only Ohio State. Their next toughest game might even be West Virginia on the road, or Wisconsin, or maybe even Minnesota on the road. I don't know. Their schedule's fairly easy. And they have about half of what Michigan does in terms of the power, the running backs, and I'd say half of the necessary defensive line play that Michigan does to do damage in the Big Ten. So a lot rests on James Franklin's shoulders, and if he can let Kotelnicki control the offense. Even if he does, there are questions. But I think Penn State is underrated by people entering the 2024 season. Overall, what I think about Ohio State in relationship to these different teams is they're a unanimous national championship contender. They're viewed that way. I think that's very fair and accurate. Their strength, like in most seasons, is their raw talent, but they also have experience and they have depth at all positions. They even have depth on the offensive line, in my opinion. The question is, can they develop the offensive line and utilize the talent that's there? Their weakness, ultimately, is their questions on the offensive line, which I don't think will all be answered this year, and their flimsy identity. This is what I was talking about with Michigan, that I said I'd get to a few seconds or minutes later. Now it's several minutes later, but it is what it is. Last year, when Michigan beat Ohio State, Michigan, for the first time in several years, had a higher ceiling than an Ohio State team. Their development and their coaching and their experience was all so much better that combined, it blew Ohio State's raw talent advantage out the window. It didn't matter that Ohio State had Marvin Harrison Jr. Why? Because Michigan had a generationally talented defense. They had Will Johnson, and even though sometimes Will Johnson lost those battles, sometimes he won them. It didn't matter that Ohio State had TreVeyon Henderson. Why? Because Michigan had the best defensive line in the country. They had Mason Graham, who is just as much of an NFL player as TreVeyon Henderson is. Ohio State, look, they finally had an elite defense, but Michigan's offensive line was gritty enough, and they finally had an elite quarterback who could pick an elite defense apart slowly, who could apply multiple paper cuts. And Michigan, of course, could still chew out the clock. And even without their head coach, they still had their offensive coordinator, Sherrone Moore, now head coach, who I think is a genius game manager and will be a very successful head coach. Michigan was just better than Ohio State. They had the higher floor, the higher ceiling, the higher average level of play. So even though Ohio State neutered the matchup advantages, Ohio State only focused on making sure they matched up properly with Michigan. They did not make sure that they were better than Michigan. They didn't. Michigan made sure that they were better than Ohio State. That's why they moved on to trying to win it all and saying that they had a beat Georgia drill, and they were focusing on Georgia more than Ohio State because they were focusing on just being the best team possible. They were focusing on being the best. Ohio State, I feel like over the past 2 seasons, This season, it's changed a little bit with the NIL. I get a sense that Ohio State's also trying to be the best team along with beating Michigan. It felt like over the previous 2 seasons, in retrospect, hindsight's 2020, that Ohio State was trying to beat Michigan more than they were trying to be the best team. And you never want to do that. Now, if you aren't a national championship contender, I understand wanting to beat your rival more than being the best team. It's more realistic. But Ohio State has the talent every single season to be the best team, so they should focus on being the best team. Michigan, last year in 22, finally had the talent that they didn't have in probably the previous decade, or maybe they were close, but it wasn't the same talent as Ohio State to win it all. They had the combination. So they focused on that. Michigan had, and probably still has, their priorities straight. I don't know if Ohio State does. Ohio State fans and staffers, if asked the question, Michigan or a national championship, should be able to honestly answer in 1 second, national championship. Michigan would have answered that last year, and maybe would answer it this year, though having won a national championship, it's not as necessary to provide that answer. Ohio State, I don't know if they would have answered it that way last year. And this year, maybe they don't, maybe they do. That question will probably never be asked, but I don't know if they'd even provide an honest answer. Ohio State needs to want the national championship more than wanting Michigan. And last year's edition of the game was the epitome of that. Ohio State wanted Michigan. Ryan Day wanted to beat Michigan, wanted to be the king of the Big Ten rather than being the king of college football. So when the time came and Ohio State finally had their best matchup advantage against Michigan since the 2019 or 2020 season, Michigan was just straight up the better team. So it didn't matter that Ohio State finally leveled the playing field in terms of, having an elite defense or having an offensive line that, look, much like Michigan's, didn't perform to their ceiling last year, but had some physical moments. It didn't matter because Michigan was pursuing something greater, and they were the greater and better team because they had their priorities straight, and also because of some other factors like returning production and such that you can't always directly control. But I hope you get that point. That's Ohio State's weakness. Outside of the offensive line, it's, do they have their priorities in straight? Is their identity set? They need to be strong, physical, and injury-free this season to win it all. And with their questions, I will say a loss to Oregon, Penn State, or Michigan. I mentioned who I have Ohio State losing to out of these 3 teams in the regular season in my live show. But here I'll just tell you I have them losing to one of these teams. You'll just have to figure out in my Big Ten predictions video. I view, though, Ohio State as the Big Ten's best team. But I don't think they're invincible. I think they're far from invincible, just like every team entering this season. There is no 2021 Georgia. There's no 2023 Michigan. There's certainly no 2020 Alabama or 2019 LSU, at least that I know of. There's not even a 2022 Georgia. And there may not even be a team that produces at the level that 2014 Ohio State did at the end of the season. I think this is going to be a very down year in college football. I really do. Thank you all so much for watching this video. Remember to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, and comment your thoughts on this video down below. Thanks to Crash2488 for sponsoring this video as a Heisman patron. Thanks to Spencer Bringhurst, Chris Lane, and Connor Little OH for sponsoring this video and channel as an All-American patron. And thanks to Will Loftus, John Lynn, Roaming Gnome, Matthew Sale, Austin Christmas, and Janisha Cockrell for sponsoring this video as an all-conference patron. Have a great day, guys, and I will see you all around. Bye-bye.